You know, any discussion of U.S.-Iranian affairs almost always starts with a list of grievances by both sides. Uh, I have to say, though, since I find the Iranian list of grievances much more impressive, I think I'm just going to move through that quickly. I will mention that as a former Foreign Service officer, of course, I remember the Iranian hostage taking, and that 444 days was quite painful professionally and personally, actually. My student teacher for drama and debate in Newton, Iowa, was one of the hostages, and so it was pretty easy for me to imagine these folks as real people in a perilous situation. But for our purposes today, the most consequential grievance on America's list is Iran's failure to carry out its full obligations as a non-nuclear weapons state under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And when I mention that treaty, I'll just use its acronym, NPT, to save a little time. Iran and the 6 countries that are negotiating with Iran right now on the nuclear question are all parties to the 1970 NPT. This treaty was a compromise between the 5 countries that had nuclear weapons in the late 1960s and the rest, which did not. Those that had promised to get rid of them. Those that had not promised not to acquire them. The U.S. and Russia, which have held more than 95% of all nuclear weapons worldwide throughout the nuclear age, have reduced tens of thousands, but each still has some 5,000 in their active inventories. Britain and France have also reduced their much smaller arsenals. China's minimum arsenal is slowly expanding, but none of these 3 countries has more than a few hundred. Unfortunately, some countries are not party to the NPT. 4 states outside the treaty have nuclear weapons. Israel, India, and Pakistan each may have around 100, and North Korea may have a few. These countries generate acute concerns that they will either use their weapons or provide them to others. Each of these states acquired nuclear weapons through clandestine programs facilitated by cheating and deceit. Many fear that Iran is on a similar trajectory to North Korea, which itself was a member of the NPT for a number of years before withdrawing. Even though Tehran denies seeking nuclear weapons and argues against their utility and morality, it does have the capability to build them. The crux of the Iran nuclear problem flows from the inherently dual-use nature of nuclear infrastructure and program activities and doubts about Iran's stated intentions. Although developing an industrial infrastructure to enrich uranium is one of the most significant technological obstacles to developing nuclear weapons, enriching uranium is not explicitly prohibited for any NPT members. Although 5 NPT non-nuclear weapons states, in addition to Iran, have this capability, the NPT nuclear weapon states don't welcome any other country's membership in this exclusive club. They would argue that uranium fuel supplies for peaceful purposes are already sufficient in the world. They're wary of the motives of any country that develops a full nuclear fuel cycle, particularly when it is done through stealth and deception. For Iran, asserting what it calls its inalienable rights under the NPT, uranium enrichment is the principal pillar of its negotiating position. And I wanted to take a minute to explain a little about uranium enrichment. It's one of the 2 paths to producing the kind of material you need for a nuclear weapon, and the other path is plutonium production. Uranium in its natural state contains a very small percentage of the fissile isotope U-235. In order to use uranium to fuel nuclear power reactors, that percentage needs to be significantly increased to 3.5%. This is very difficult to do and requires an elaborate high-tech infrastructure. For an example, an ability to build and operate centrifuges with specialty metals that can spin at very high speeds. But once such a capacity has been developed for producing low-enriched uranium, most of the distance has already been traveled for enriching to the 90% concentration level required for nuclear weapons. Although the higher the level of enrichment achieved, the easier it is to produce fissile material for nuclear weapons, there are no hard and fast treaty prohibitions on enrichment levels for peaceful purposes among non-nuclear weapon states. The NPT does not rule out reactors using 20% enriched uranium to produce medical isotopes, which is what the Iranians have been doing. The treaty does not even rule out naval propulsion reactors using 90% enriched uranium, the same level used for the core of nuclear weapons, because naval propulsion is considered a peaceful activity. It's up to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, to negotiate safeguards agreements with parties to the NPT, which help it to determine the accuracy of those states' declarations and to verify the exclusively peaceful nature of their nuclear activities. Most states using nuclear power buy their fuel from abroad, but for whatever reason, Iran, during the Shah's time and afterward, has been determined to develop a domestic uranium enrichment capacity. And here is the rub. Iran has behaved suspiciously with regard to implementing its safeguards obligations. It has not always provided timely notification of plans for constructing new nuclear-related facilities. It has not cooperated fully in IAEA investigations of possible military dimensions of past activities. It has developed a uranium enrichment capability and accumulated enriched uranium stockpiles greatly disproportionate to the fuel needs of its existing and planned nuclear power reactors. It has not accepted enhanced IAEA inspection rights under the additional protocol. It has not ratified the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The U.S. intelligence community determined in 2007 that Iranian military entities had been working under government direction to develop nuclear weapons up until the fall of 2003. An IAEA Director General's report in November 2011 told a similar story, adding that it could not rule out that some relevant activity was continuing. On November 24th, the parties in Geneva, the 6 powers in Iran, negotiated a joint plan of action to resolve Iran nuclear issues. And this agreement just kicked in last month on January 20th. During a 6-month interim phase under this action plan, Iran will freeze or in some cases roll back its uranium enrichment activities and heavy water reactor construction, addressing both the uranium and plutonium routes to acquiring fissile materials for weapons. It will also accept a much enhanced inspections regimen by the IAEA in exchange for an easing of peripheral sanctions and allowance of transactions in precious metals and certain spare parts. The interim phase will leave Iran's nuclear infrastructure and the international community's core sanctions intact, but will provide a breathing space for negotiating a comprehensive and long-lasting solution. The IAEA has already confirmed that Iran has halted production of 20% enriched uranium and begun diluting its existing 20% stockpile. Iran has also halted major work on the Arak heavy water project, which has the potential to produce spent fuel from which plutonium could be extracted for a bomb. The payments of $4.2 billion in frozen Iranian funds will be released to Iran in monthly increments on condition that Iran adheres to the terms of the agreement. Moreover, if it does not, the limited sanctions relief can also be quickly suspended. The first installment of cash occurred on schedule February 1st. These and other steps in the interim phase mean that by July, Iran will be farther from potentially acquiring a nuclear weapon than it is today. In other words, several weeks will have been added to the amount of time that it would theoretically take Iran to produce enough weapons-grade uranium for one nuclear weapon. And the sides will have established a track record to build confidence in their good faith implementation of future agreements. These negotiations will be very difficult. President Obama puts their chances at 50-50. The deputy Iranian negotiator rates them lower. Gary Seymour, a member of President Obama's National Security Council in his first term, says that an agreement in the next 6 months is extremely unlikely. I am somewhat more hopeful. I think the Iranian public is weary of economic hardship and isolation, and it is still suffering from the trauma of its 8-year total war with Iraq. The last thing the U.S. public wants is to be thrown into another war in the Middle East, bigger and more dangerous than the 2 previous ones. The presidents residing in Washington and Tehran have one important thing in common. Both want to find a mutually acceptable compromise. And the U.S. and Iranian negotiating teams are highly competent and relatively non-ideological. Moreover, the 6 powers opposite Iran at the negotiating table have maintained solidarity in spite of the obviously differing perspectives they bring to the process. And this limits Iran's ability to divide and conquer as a tactical matter in the negotiations. So to keep track of all this, the Arms Control Association has developed on its website a handy implementation of the Joint Plan of Action at a glance, and this is available just by going to armscontrol.org. Moreover, you can also join our association and get the monthly magazine, which can also help you keep track of that. Just remember that ACA means different things to different people. And we've been getting a lot of complaints at our organization about health care. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. ACA. Good. Thank you. Hillary, take it away.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having us here today. It's a pleasure to see everyone, especially all the students here. I have been seriously working on and studying Iran and the Middle East for more than 25 years, including in the U.S. government, at the White House, at the Department of State, U.S. mission to the UN in New York, and at U.S. embassies across the Middle East. But it wasn't until early 2001 that I had the chance to meet with, speak to, and this is critically important, listen to Iranians and Iranian officials who supported the Islamic Republic of Iran. For the 15 years prior, when I was intensely studying and working in and on the Middle East, I had only met and read the so-called authoritative accounts of Iranian domestic politics and foreign policy from many that we call experts here in Washington, nearly all of whom want to see the Islamic Republic undermined, if not have the revolution from 1979 reversed. But from 2001 to 2003, I helped open and then was one of a handful of American diplomats, small number of U.S. officials authorized to talk to Iranian officials about Afghanistan and al-Qaeda in the wake of 9/11. One of my principal Iranian interlocutors at the time was a rather mid-level official, but now the foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif. After 9/11, we in the U.S. government were literally flying blind on Afghanistan. We had no understanding of on-the-ground dynamics. We had no plan of action to deal with what had happened here on 9/11. But my Iranian colleagues, including the now Foreign Minister Zarif, really had a granular understanding of dynamics and relationships in Afghanistan and a strategic perspective that included an intelligence and military plan to deal with the Taliban and, more importantly, a political plan for reconstitution of Afghanistan that would be based on a constitution and a participatory political process, not because they're Jeffersonian Democrats, but because they understood that that was the way to prevent a return to the chaos that had led to the Taliban coming into Afghanistan to begin with, and to prevent a prolonged U.S. military occupation. Now, I recount that for the lessons that I think it gives us today with what's going on. The first is, and I need to say this clearly, there is a canard out there that Iranians are deceptive in their DNA. That is what our current Undersecretary of State, Wendy Sherman, who I like personally, who wants to get a deal, who I think is a good person, but she said in testimony on the Hill that don't worry, we're not going to trust the Iranians. We know they're deceptive in their DNA. That is simply wrong. And it's racist. If she had said that about Jewish Americans, African Americans, just about anyone but Muslims, she would have been fired. I can tell you from personal experience that Iranian officials, and especially this team being led by Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, can and have negotiated honestly, effectively, and strategically on a range of issues critical to the United States. Another lesson I take from my experience is that even when negotiations are successful on issues of critical importance to the United States, like Afghanistan, they are at risk for absolute failure if they're not part of a larger understanding. The negotiations we had with Iran over Afghanistan helped the United States. But as they were going on, my then boss at the time, without telling the US diplomats, including myself, who were dealing with the Iranians, decided to designate Iran as part of the axis of evil, essentially to make Iran a target, an American target in the war on terror, because of something that Israeli intelligence had said the Iranians had done vis-a-vis the Palestinians, which had nothing to do with Afghanistan, the issue we were talking about. So then Iran's ties to these groups that we designate as terrorist organizations and their nuclear program became the justification, if not a pretext, for ever more what we call crippling sanctions, and for hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, in covert operations to undermine, if not set the stage for all-out war against Iran. Now many pundits tell us that this course of strategy worked. It worked to force a dictatorial supreme leader in Iran to accept the overwhelming popular will of Iranians to select a new president who could come to the table and make the concessions that we in Washington require. This, in my view, is a dangerous and ultimately self-defeating falsehood. First, because it ignores reality in Iran. Yes, the economy in Iran has taken a hit over the past year because of sanctions, but the IMF has recorded consistent growth in the Iranian economy every year since 1992, even when we were in the midst of recession. And yes, they took a hit and they're in recession this year, but the IMF projects that they'll get out of recession next year. And when I go to Iran, the shops are fully stocked. People are shopping all over the place. The best restaurants in North Tehran are full, and the more ordinary ones in South Tehran are full. But more important than that is that sanctions have never worked to drive a population to rise up, to force their government to accept the demands of a hostile foreign power. We tried that in Iraq, and the sanctions that we imposed on Iraq only ended up killing 1 million Iraqis, half of whom were children, and all of that before the 2003 invasion. And more than that, the sanctions didn't do anything to change Saddam Hussein's calculation or collapse his government. That took the all-out invasion in 2003. And even now today, we hardly have a strategically subordinated Iraq. Refusing to recognize the profoundly negative human and strategic consequences of sanctions, precedent warns us, leads to war, not conflict resolution. The conventional narrative out there about sanctions also badly misreads Iran's new president, Hassan Rouhani. He was elected with just over 50% of the vote. And while hard-earned and decisive, it was not a landslide. It was just over 50%. And President Rouhani, the only cleric on the ballot last year in Iran, is not a reformist. He's from Iran's main conservative clerical society, not its reformist antipode. It is more accurate to describe him as a moderate or pragmatic conservative, not someone who is going to surrender what Iran views as its nuclear rights. He is dedicated to the Islamic Republic. He has spent nearly all of his adult life and career defending the Islamic Republic's security and its international position. Beyond misreading Rouhani, falsehoods about what his election signifies are self-defeating because Iran's willingness to work with and to improve relations with the United States is not new. In fact, the core elements that Iran has put forward that are now the working basis for the joint plan of action, both Foreign Minister Zarif and President Rouhani offered 10 years ago. President Rouhani, when he was Iran's negotiator with the Europeans, negotiations we refused to join, offered it then. And Zarif, he put it in a New York Times op-ed in 2006. Even former President Ahmadinejad and his foreign ministers put the elements of this proposal forward. The problem has not been what Iran is willing or not willing to concede. The problem is much more with us. Because until September of this year, the United States has refused to respect and deal with Iran's basic conditions. They are, one, accept the sovereignty of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Two, accept the Islamic Republic of Iran as an enduring and legitimate political entity. And three, to recognize that it represents legitimate national interests. I've been going now to Iran every few months for the past several years to do research for my book, to give lectures at the University of Tehran, and to participate in Track 2 talks. To be sure, those close to the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, say that he has grown increasingly skeptical over the years that the United States will ever be able to accept the Islamic Republic on the basis that I just laid out. But even with his deep skepticism about American intentions, Khamenei, more than anyone else in Iranian political life today, has set this core position. The Islamic Republic is open to improved relations with the United States, but only on the basis of mutual respect and the acceptance of Iran's sovereignty. This is one of the strongest consensus positions in all of Iranian foreign policy. So why is it so hard for us to deal with the Islamic Republic on this basis? In my view, the fundamental problem has been our determination, especially since the end of the Cold War, to dominate the Middle East, to achieve a kind of hegemonic status over this strategically vital part of the world. As part of this quest to dominate the Middle East, which went into overdrive after 9/11, the United States has been unwilling to countenance real, independent power centers in the Middle East. And this is the critical challenge that the Islamic Republic of Iran poses. The opportunity for us in these negotiations with Iran is that a real, improved U.S.-Iranian relationship would end America's quest for hegemony in the Middle East, a quest that has done, in my view, such profound damage to our security and to the lives of hundreds of millions of people in the Middle East.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure being here. Found the previous presentations very interesting, and I'll try to build off of them a little bit. We discussed, some of the technicalities of the nuclear issue. We discussed some of the history that has existed between the two sides. I'd like to go in a little bit deeper and say, mindful of all of this, and we don't have to accept everything, but mindful of that larger picture. Why is it then that under these circumstances, for the last 6 months, there has been an extremely successful negotiation that has produced a deal that is entering a new phase in which negotiations for the final deal are taking place, where the elements in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress that are opposed to this, who have been very decisive in the past, now at least temporarily have been put on the defensive, if not defeated. Why is it that this shift has taken place? Why is it that the administration has become so much more focused and determined about diplomacy compared to what it's been in the previous 3 years? So I would list a couple of factors. I think there is a narrative out there that, of course, sanctions did everything. I would agree with some of the things that Hillary mentioned, that this is a highly, in my view, exaggerated narrative. I think it's rooted partly in the fact that we only have one instrument with Iran up until diplomacy actually kicked in, which is we only had sanctions. So whatever happens in Iran, obviously it has to be because of our sanctions. What else could it possibly be? We haven't done anything else, right? So there's been a natural tendency of, ascribing almost everything to sanctions, and I can go into a little bit more detail about that. But I think the couple of factors that we have to take into consideration begins with the fact that the election of Rouhani in June of last year really opened up a whole new set of opportunities. Partly because of the fact that this is a team, as Hillary mentioned, that has a lot of experience with diplomacy and has a long history of trying to create some form of an opening with the West and with the US in particular. This is not something they have been convinced of just recently because of economic pressure. This is something that they pursued even more aggressively before, but under those circumstances during the Bush years, there wasn't much receptivity here in Washington, D.C. That team coming in, which then also reduces the political difficulties on the American side, because there was a certain degree of political toxicity to deal with the Ahmadinejad government, which essentially is gone. It's one thing to deal with someone who shares his theories about the Holocaust and it being a myth, etc., to an Iranian president that tweets Happy Rosh Hashanah tweets to the Jewish people worldwide. It creates a very different political environment and ability to deal with that. And I think this has been a very critical thing, because had the elections in Iran produced a different outcome, had it been Jalili who was the nuclear negotiator, had he become the president, which I personally think was unlikely under all circumstances, but had that happened, I don't think we would have seen any of the diplomacy that currently is taking place. He would still be stuck in the language that existed prior to the success of these negotiations. Another thing that happened that I think has not been particularly focused on is the fact that the way the Syria debate evolved, and from the administration's perspective, who were seeking a military intervention, became a debacle, actually became very helpful for what is happening right now. Because what happened there was that the president went out and said that for the reasons that he mentioned, there was a need for a military engagement in Syria. And he decided to go to Congress, which then gave the American public an opportunity to weigh in. And boy, did they weigh in. They weighed in a way that the administration and Congress was completely stunned by. The ferocity of the American public's opposition to military intervention in Syria took almost everyone by surprise. Some members of Congress reported that they got about 1,000 phone calls against it for every 3 phone calls they got in favor of it. And that did something very interesting. It showed that the political cost of pursuing diplomacy, which always in the White House was viewed as being very, very high because of some special interests that have been very negative about this, that political cost actually was not as high compared to the political cost you would have to pay if this issue is not resolved and you end up in a military confrontation. The reaction of the American public to the Syria proposition essentially pushed the Obama administration deep into diplomacy territory. I thought it was quite interesting. In the President's State of the Union 2 weeks ago or so, in which even on the issue of Iran, he shifted emphasis. It was no longer this opportunity has been created by the pressure of sanctions. Instead, he said this opportunity has been created by diplomacy. And then he added, backed by pressure. But it was backed by pressure. It wasn't the central thing. And I think this is a shift, and it's part of the reason also at the administration when dealing with the issue in the Senate, in which some senators were trying to push for new sanctions in spite of the success of the negotiations. And the administration came out in a press release and said that if members of the Senate actually want a war with Iran, they should just come out and say so. Because otherwise it's difficult to understand why they're pushing for sanctions that would undermine these negotiations. That really put the sanctions proponents on the defensive, because if there's anything you don't want to do in today's political reality in Washington and the country as a whole, in fact, even more so outside of Washington, is to come across as someone that is pushing for a military confrontation. So none of that could have happened had Syria not happened the way it happened. And it created a different analysis of what the political cost is to pursue diplomacy. A third factor is again, it's an indirect factor, but very important, is that the rest of the Middle East is pretty much in shambles right now. If you're trying to fix something, and you're a president who increasingly going to think about legacy, what would you do? Would you put all of your eggs in Syria, Israel, Palestine, Egypt? Not saying that the administration is not focusing on these issues, but compared to all of those, Iran suddenly looks solvable. Whereas just a year ago, you would think that Iran was a complete impossibility and it is almost useless to try anything. And that shifted quite dramatically. And again, as I mentioned, the president is looking for a legacy. And if this issue with Iran succeeds, and I would put it as higher than 50-50, this will be his biggest foreign policy success and will define his foreign policy legacy in this area. And it's going to have significant implications for the Middle East as a whole. If the US-Iran relationship becomes functional, almost every other conflict in the region becomes easier to resolve. Not because the US and Iran are necessarily forced to be involved in everything, but reality is almost every other conflict in the region have become more complex, more complicated, because the US and Iran almost automatically end up on the opposite side of it, and they don't communicate. But now if they communicate, and if they can find commonalities, that doesn't mean that the region is going to become paradise 2 days from tomorrow, but it means that it's easier to be able to address these issues. And then the last factor I would list before I stop, which is the most important factor. The factor that almost no one is going to emphasize, neither in Tehran, in Brussels, or in Washington. But reality is these negotiations and this issue is being resolved for a very simple reason. And that reason is both sides are compromising. Both sides are accepting the other side's bottom line. For years, the Iranians have insisted they will not give up enrichment on their soil. It's a sovereign issue. In many quarters, it's been quite clear for some time that there is no solution if we're pushing for complete zero. But in Washington, resistance to that has probably lasted longer than anywhere else. One of the things that has kind of been missed, and I guess it's because the administration has been very good in their communication, is we're not talking as much about the fact that we, from the American side, have accepted Iran's bottom line. We're no longer pushing for zero enrichment. Had we accepted that bottom line 8 years ago, my suspicion is this issue would have been resolved 8 years ago. At the same time, the Iranians have accepted the Western bottom line, which is there's not going to be a weapon built in Iran. And, of course, providing the transparency and the verification system that enables the West to feel comfortable that Iran is living up to its side of the bargain. The additional protocol and the ratification of it is going to be part of the end deal. If, of course, from the American side and the European side, equally valuable incentives are put on the table. And that's important to understand. At this point, what we get is not based on what we pressure. It's based on what we offer. And that's why there actually is a deal. In fact, that's almost always why there is a deal. But for political reasons, no one brags about the compromises they do. They brag about what they managed to get from the other side and try to keep as quiet as possible or whatever was offered. The worst example of that, of course, is what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which, again, the United States compromised, managed to resolve the issue by removing the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. But for more than 20 years, the myth that was created in Washington was, paraphrased by Dean Rusk or whatever his name was, which is that the US and Russia went eyeball to eyeball and the other side blinked. Essentially, capturing the entirety of statecraft to just standing your ground, being firm, and never compromising. Whereas in reality, that would have gotten us World War III. Fortunately, the JFK administration compromised and the issue was resolved. Same thing is happening here. Unfortunately, the political culture neither here nor in Tehran is such in which one takes much value in bringing attention to what those compromises are. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I have some questions, but do you have some questions? I will yield to you before. Let's just go, just stand up, and this is being recorded, so when you make your question, please, I don't know whether you can pick it up, but speak very loudly so we can pick up the question, and so everybody can hear. So why don't you stand up and just tell us who you are, and then ask your question. I'm gonna take 2 or 3 questions, so if y'all be so kind as to kind of take note of about what the questions are. And you know, our rule, you don't have to disguise a comment as a question. You can actually make a comment. Sure.
Hi, my name's Aaron. I'm a first-year graduate student here at American University, and wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Professor Lever, and I had class with her last semester. Became interested in this topic. I was wondering if any member of the panel could speak to some of the pressures that are applied onto the United States and their diplomatic efforts with Iran from regional allies, specifically Saudi Arabia and Israel, and kind of talk a little bit about that dynamic where if the United States is seen as helping Iran, other countries might feel like it's hurting them regionally.
Great, thank you. We have some more hands up over here. Yes. Stand up and tell us who you are and ask your question.
My name is Erica. I'm a Washington semester program student here. I'm originally from New Jersey. My question is in the domestic realm. What do you think Iran's strongest points and weakest points when it comes to reform and success?
Good. Yes. Yes, sir.
My name is Leonard Sabari. I'm an SIS major. This came from Iran just a couple months ago. I have a question for you, sir. You pointed out that the sanctions were the factors that brought the Iranians to the negotiating table. Don't you think that this quagmire that America has created for itself in Iraq and Afghanistan has also, and also the 19,000 centrifuges in Iran, have also brought the Americans to the table? And the second question is for Dr. Parsi. I had the opportunity to meet the former deputy foreign minister of Iran, Mr. Sarah Kharazi, over the winter break in Iran, and I asked him about the possibility of the opening of embassies in Washington and Tehran. So he said explicitly it's not possible, at least during Dr. Rouhani's presidency. What do you think about that?
All right. Anybody else? Yes.
Yes, my name is Carl Weichel, and I ask these questions to the panel. Firstly, the presumption that sanctions do not work, I don't think is accurate. They've worked successfully in South Africa. They've worked recently successfully in Myanmar, where the American administration put pressure for the military generals to trade in their uniforms for suits. I believe they do work. On the other hand, this is a unique window of opportunity to solve or head forward diplomatically, and in our administration only has about 2 years left, and we have a unique opportunity with our sometime ally, sometime adversary in Russia. Is it important now for the timing for this to actually achieve our goals, to have Russia come in and partner with us, and especially before the next election cycle where there may be an opposing force to pull back?
Good. I'm going to let you all just kind of, you can respond to all or one or.
Should just start like this.
Okay.
Yeah, you can start.
Okay, pressure from allies. I would, first of all, commend to all of you Dr. Parsi's really enlightened, very well-researched and documented book called Treacherous Alliance, which is a must-read, I think, for anybody who wants to understand the dynamic between Israel and the Islamic Republic of Iran. I would say more broadly, and this is somewhat of a controversial point, we often characterize Iran's foreign policies as hegemonic in the region, that they want to have dominance in their neighborhood. That was the Shah's foreign policy. I think the Islamic Republic has a much different foreign policy, in some ways like China, which also gets characterized here as hegemonic, but is a much more subtle, much more complicated foreign policy. But like the Shah, the Israelis and the Saudis, in my view, pursue hegemonic foreign policies. They are both looking for and rely on dominance in the region. Now, maybe in each of their narratives for very, very good reasons, because they face a variety of kind of threats. But those are the two that need it. And in order to have it, they need to have the United States fully backing them with a tremendous amount of military hardware in order to achieve a strategy that neither of them could do on their own, because either in Israel's case it's very small, or in Saudi Arabia's case it just can't field that kind of military might. So that's where I think they're principally concerned, that if there is a rapprochement between the United States and Iran under any government, so Saudi Arabia had concerns under the Shah's government, that means that Iran is back as a major player in the region. The United States' role wouldn't be to leave, but would be to not be as militarized, to pull back somehow. And there wouldn't be as much of a justification for the enormous amount, not just for Israel, but for Saudi Arabia. We have sold to the Gulf $75 billion in armaments over the past 6 years. Chuck Hagel just testified about that a few months ago. So that's a really important dynamic that they're concerned about. Now, it doesn't mean you say tough, too bad. But you have to keep in mind that they probably would adapt, and they might even be better off. When we opened to China, there were similar concerns from Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. And what happened? They were scared, and they were rightfully scared. But all three adapted, and I would argue that all three went through the biggest economic boons and boons to their political development in their histories, because the threat of war was removed. Now, of course, China became a much bigger player, but they all did just fine. I'll say very quickly on Iranian the domestic theme. I think the biggest positive that we could look to, and that we should try to look to more honestly than we have over the past 35 years of the Islamic Republic's history, is their perspective on and real success in human development. You know, the UNDP Human Development Report ranks them in one of the highest categories. Them and South Korea are the two that have brought about the biggest change over the past generation. Just to give you a quick example, literacy in Iran for women in 1979, particularly for outside of Tehran, was about 7%. In Tehran, it was a bit higher, but it was 7% outside of Tehran. Today, all over the country, for the people that the Islamic Republic has educated, age 15 to 24, 97% literacy for men and women, with no distinction. The World Bank says that they are very close to achieving gender equality in access to education. So that's where I think they're the strongest. Where, of course, they're the weakest, and we see this, and it's constantly emphasized here, is in terms of the openness of the system, the paranoia, the fear, that, of course, has also been magnified by the conflict with the United States. Finally, for sanctions, I give a lot more credit on South Africa to the ANC and to Nelson Mandela, their armed struggle and their political vision. And, but it's a point that we could certainly argue or discuss afterwards. And similar with Myanmar, I think it was a real change in the administration's policy led by a senator from Virginia to open up and actually have a diplomatic relationship with Myanmar. But of course, we can discuss that. The point on Russia, though, I think is something to really be somewhat wary of. Russia is, of course, an important player, but in Iran, the concern about Russia, the fear about Russia is real and it's deep. And even though we always see Russia as Iran's ally, that's not the perspective in Tehran. The Russians had occupied part of Tehran for some time, and the Iranians are, across the board, often see Russia as playing a double game.
Thank you. Take the question regarding some other regional players. Hillary covered some of it. Let me just go a little bit deeper on Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has been quite openly skeptical, quite negative towards this development. I think, however, while the Iran factor in Saudi Arabia's calculation here is important, I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. What you see for Saudi Arabia is a sharply changing geopolitical environment that is rooted in the fact that after the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, Iran has become a much more powerful player in the region. That is rooted in the fact that the United States, after having invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, are not particularly hungry for any more military adventures and is actually explicitly seeking to reduce its military footprint in the region as a whole. It is rooted in the fact that as the Arab Spring occurred, the United States' conclusion was that the previous status quo in the region was no longer tenable. Meaning the idea that the United States should just continue to prop up some of these authoritarian states in the region through these military commitments, etc., and turn a complete blind eye to the desires of the population. On the contrary, we saw in Saudi Arabia, with the caveat that it was at the last possible moment, there was a shift towards the protesters in Tahrir Square, something that the Saudis viewed as a betrayal of Mubarak, because Mubarak had been a loyal ally in that narrative, etc., etc., and the United States had an obligation to continue to support him. That, combined with the fact that there were some efforts by the United States to mediate between the protesters in Bahrain and the ruling regime in Bahrain, all gave the Saudis essentially the impression that the United States is giving up on a long-term promise that it had made to the security of the House of Saud. Add to that, of course, that there is new oil discoveries and new ways of extracting oil, which is reducing the U.S.'s dependence on Saudi oil. All of that together, and combine it then that the United States and Iran suddenly may actually have a functioning relationship, and I think that goes a very far way in explaining why there is a bit of a panic in Saudi Arabia right now. But had the U.S.-Iran solution come at a very different moment, in which all of those other factors had not occurred, I personally believe that the Saudis would have been grunting a little bit, they would have been a little bit suspicious, a little bit worried, a little bit nervous, but you would not have seen the reaction that you see right now. This reaction, I think, is rooted in several other factors that is causing them to be extremely worried. When it comes to the internal situation in Iran, I think Iran has tremendous amount of challenges, and I think the most difficult one, or one of the most difficult ones, is the human rights situation in Iran, in which I think the Rouhani administration is having significant difficulties making systemic changes. Meaning, there is one thing to release political prisoners, and I think that should be commended, that Nasrin Sotoudeh and 100 others have been released, but the real test of this is not to release political prisoners, is to make sure that you don't arrest and create new political prisoners, to make sure that you have a functioning judiciary that doesn't put people in jail or even execute them without giving them a fair trial, at times not even giving them access to lawyers. I personally believe that there are elements in the regime that want to change some of these things, and they're faced obviously with a lot of difficulties and resistance. There's another more quiet struggle that is going on, which is the struggle of the control of the telecommunications in Iran, in which you have the Iranian IRGC getting major control of it during the Ahmadinejad years, and there's a fight to be able to reverse that, which is going to have a significant impact on almost everything else. But I think to sum it up is to say that I think it's critical that the issue with the United States is resolved. Because in the absence of a resolution to this conflict, I find it very difficult for those who are seeking change inside of Iran to be able to have the space to do so. In fact, if the moderates in Iran do not succeed in getting a deal right now, then the moderates in Iran are going to be marginalized, and you're going to have a resurgence of the more conservative forces who certainly are not even going to try to pretend that they care about human rights. So I think it's critical that this is successful first in order to be able to open up the path for changes elsewhere. But I don't think there's any doubt, and I don't think there's any doubt in the government's own mind, that there is a desire and expectation that this government has to fix things not just on the economic front, not just on the political front, but also internally. And it was not for no reason that Rouhani made the campaign promise over and over again that he was going to break the securitized atmosphere in the country. This is something that has been suffocating the people, and I think he knows that he has to deliver on that promise. Otherwise, he will face a lot of political difficulties.
And let me start by responding to the comments from the Iranian in the room, which I very much appreciate, by the way. It shows that American University is much more enlightened than the U.S. government with its regard to the Syria discussions. I may have given you the wrong impression that I subscribe to the notion that the only reason that the Iranians are talking with us is because of the sanctions. We forced them to the table and so forth. I would argue that the sanctions have played a role. I think that the dramatic decrease in oil revenues, for example, Iran has a pretty big reserve with the kind of powerful access to oil that it has. So it's got a lot that it can give up before its economy collapses. But I think it's very hard to find economists who say that Iran has not taken a very serious hit from the sanctions that have been applied both by the United Nations Security Council, but also by this combination of European and U.S. unilateral sanctions. But one should not overestimate the ability of sanctions to force governments to do things, and that's where I'm very sympathetic to some of the things that both Hillary and Trita have said. Some of us, I guess probably all of us at this table, have worked pretty hard to argue against the idea that ramping up sanctions right now would have any kind of constructive effect on our goal of making sure that Iran doesn't develop nuclear weapons. In fact, this is a good example of where those who think that sanctions can force capitulation are just dead wrong. Governments tend to react rather defiantly to someone saying that you have to raise a white flag of surrender and make all the compromises. We will make no compromise. I mean, we just have to put ourselves in Iran's shoes. How would we react under those circumstances? There are many examples of how we would react. It's pretty obvious. So one should understand both what sanctions can do and what they do not do. Sanctions have given Iran an incentive to, well, let me put it a different way. The sanctions have raised the costs of not having a decent relationship with not just the U.S. and Europe, but with China and Russia. China and Russia have been joining us in sanctions. I think several years ago, the Iranians were quite confident that the Chinese and the Russians would prevent them from being the victim of the international community sanctions. It didn't work out that way. And I think it's one of the small minor miracles that you still have solidarity among 6 countries, including Russia and China, that rarely agree on much of anything. So Iran notices that. Iran is a sophisticated country. Iran is very different than North Korea. It does not want to be isolated in the world, does not want to be a pariah state. And the fact that there's a political impact and benefit from sanctions, independent of economic, it's an uncomfortable position for Iran. It gets in the way of Iran becoming the kind of country that it wants to become, to develop fully its energy sector and to do other things it wants to engage. It doesn't necessarily want to get all of its products from China rather than Europe or the United States. So sanctions is somewhat of a nuanced issue, but I guess the final thought that I would make on sanctions about whether they work or not, and this gets back to what points Carl was making, it's almost always left out of the discussion about whether or not sanctions work to address one of the things that sanctions does, which is to make it more difficult for countries that want to get nuclear weapons technology, including the delivery systems for nuclear weapons. It makes it harder for them to make progress to improve the technology to acquire things that they need. And I think it's fair to say that Iran has had difficulty improving the quality of its centrifuges. One of the reasons is because some of the metals are very exotic, especially metals that are very hard to get. And the international sanction regime has made it very difficult for Iran to get the kind of metal it needs for centrifuges. So one should not forget about the proliferation benefits without jumping to the conclusion that therefore that sanctions can get you 100% of what you want. They can at least slow things down. The fact that Iran is operating today 10,000 centrifuges that are called IR-1s, but are basically the P-1s of Pakistan, developed many years ago, indicates that things haven't been going very well with the technological development. One of the reasons is because of the fairly rigorous sanctions regime against it.
Could I say
Sure.
2 short points on
Yes,
sanctions as
yes.
well? I mean, we're largely in agreement. There's just some nuances. I would say the main problem that I have with the narrative that is out there that sanctions worked is because it essentially assumes that the conflict started about 6 months ago. And as a result, we had this leverage. We don't talk about the leverage the Iranians had, which is that they actually built 19,000 centrifuges and advanced their stockpiles, etc., which essentially, whatever leverage sanctions gave, I think the Iranian leverage, both of them essentially cancel each other out. And if anything, sanctions and the Iranian escalation of the program convinced both sides that just escalating is not going to win them the issue. They had to exhaust those pipe dreams before they came back and settled for a compromise. But the main problem with the sanctions narrative is that it completely forgets that there were numerous opportunities in the last 8 years in which this issue could be resolved. This issue could have been resolved, or a major step could have been taken in that direction in 2010 when Turkey and Brazil mediated and managed to get the Iranians to agree to an American proposal that had been put in front of the Iranians 9 months earlier. The Iranians essentially rejected it back then, but now they agreed to it with some modifications. And that was all prior to some of these tougher sanctions, and it would have created a similar opening as exists right now. Reduce the pace, improve the atmosphere, and open up the opportunity for further negotiations. The Iranians had less leverage back then because they had just started 20%. They didn't have a stockpile of it, etc., etc. So it's dangerous if we create a narrative that credits everything to sanctions, because then it teaches those of us and those of you who are going to be practicing policy down the road that the only thing that ultimately opens up issues is that you find the best hammer you can find and bang the crap out of someone. And that's just not the way statecraft actually works. And that's the problem with that narrative. It turns a complete blind eye to all of the missed opportunities that could have resolved this issue.
Great. We have time for about one or two more questions. Yes, ma'am. Hi. Tell us who you are and ask your question.
My name is Batul. I'm a Washington semester student from Kuwait. My question is, I actually have two questions. The first thing, during Ahmadinejad's administration, we heard a lot about the Iranian regime being very paranoid about the United States wanting regime change, and all of the United States measures being geared towards, overthrowing the theocratic state in Iran. Is that paranoia? Does it actually exist? And to what degree has it been tempered with the coming in of Rouhani? And another thing with the relationship with Iran's neighbors in the region, how can the United States leverage relationships with more ambivalent countries like Turkey? Turkey has pretty good relations with Iran compared to places like Saudi Arabia. How can the United States leverage that towards its negotiations? Thank you.
Very good question. Now, I'm going to reserve the right. I'm sorry. Well, go ahead then, real quick. You're a journalist.
Yeah.
Tell us your name.
Mossadegh Khatouzian. There is this firm position of pro-sanction that both of you have been very critical of. And there are these interest groups that push that forward. Now, within those groups, which one has the potential, which ones have the potential of changing their mind and revising the position? Because as you know, part of this negotiation needs to bring them, if it needs to be successful. Is that a possibility, or what's the situation?
Very good. And I reserve the right to ask the very last question, which is February the 20th, as I understand it, the interim agreement went into force.
January.
I'm sorry, January, what did I say? January, we haven't got to February. January the 20th. Not quite 2 weeks, almost 2 weeks. What does it look like? What are the hopes of both sides sticking to the agreement and 6 months out? And so I would ask you to make brief and concluding remarks.
Well, Henry Kissinger used to say that even, paranoids have enemies. So when I think I loosely use the term in response to your question in terms of what I see are some of the challenges in Iran in terms of some of the paranoia, I think it is fact-based. is based on not just what's happened since 1979, but before, and not just the United States, but every major power that has looked at Iran as this geostrategic pivot, this crossroads of civilization over resources, not just the resource, but the trade routes, everything, has made every major power for, not just now, but going back in time, Russia, UK, the United States, have all wanted to have maybe not occupy it, but at least have dispositive influence over decision making in Iran. So this is something that goes way back, and it's not just among Islamists or clerics. It's across the spectrum in Iranian political life and strategic culture. But beyond that, there are actual, real, documented points about what the United States has done, particularly over the past 10 years, to pursue regime change. Though it is, there are journalist reports that are documented in terms of the hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars that were allocated and used for covert operations to undermine, if not bring down, the Islamic Republic. Some of those included assassinating Iranian scientists in the street. One of them in front of a kindergarten that I actually passed every time I went from the University of Tehran guest house to the University of Tehran where I was giving lectures. So how do I feel walking on the street in terms of a selfish perspective? To a range of other things like Stuxnet, the computer virus, and other kinds of viruses that were implanted into Iranian computers. So there's paranoia, but I think the paranoia is grounded in some really important reality. In terms of interest groups, I'm going to defer to Trita, because in addition to his book, what he has done in terms of creating space, particularly for Iranian Americans, to have a different perspective than bring down the Islamic Republic now, has been extraordinary. So I'm just going to defer to him on that. In terms of January 20th and both sides adhering, I think that you will see a lot of adherence. In one reason is that even though, as Trita mentioned, there was some compromise, in the end, they're not doing anything that's all that painful in reality. It may be painful to their political backers in some cases, but the Iranians had achieved what they wanted to achieve in terms of their nuclear program at this point. When I first started negotiating with Zarif and Rouhani back in 2003, they were spending zero centrifuges. The leaps and bounds that program has been capable of, has done, has produced, is tremendous. So that they have to take 6 months out, or even a year or 5 years to stand still, in terms of what they've achieved, it just doesn't. They don't need to be progressing full force at this point. And in terms of what we're doing here. What we're doing here is allowing some cash, that's Iran's cash, to go from banks that have sequestered it in China and Japan, allowing some of that to go. But it's very little that's coming from the United States. We've had no trade. We've had no investment. So it's not as if anything is really moving from here. So even though some of it has been hard politically, what it basically does, and what I think the real power of this agreement, and what particularly this Iranian team brings to the table that is so important, is both Rouhani and Zarif have PhDs in international law. And what they did was they put forward not a proposal of what Iran has to have as Iran, but they used the NPT. They used an international legal instrument, maybe the most successful international legal instrument in the history of international law. They used that. And now there's an international body, the IAEA, that is monitoring it for implementation. So it's not dependent on just the politics on each side.
Well, that was a very good question. Those different groups. I don't think I'll go into names, but just say something more generic. For some of the groups, the fight for sanctions hasn't necessarily got much to do with the Iran issue per se. Some of these things have just become industries of themselves. And as a result, you just keep on pushing, because the more you push and the more you can show that you're doing something, you can prop up your base, you can raise more money, etc. Some of them, I think, have their interests perhaps more tied to more grounded elements, and as a result, I think are quite capable of shifting. But they're not going to shift until they absolutely have to shift. And I think it's also important to turn up, because when you read the papers, you hear, okay, APAC, the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee is out there, and they're one of the most pro-sanctions groups. it's also very important to understand that the Jewish American community is very much split on this, because other groups such as Americans for Peace Now, J Street are exactly on the opposite side of that debate and very, very active on Capitol Hill pushing against sanctions, precisely because they're convinced of the logic that if these negotiations fail, we're going to be steering down the barrel of a war. And they don't want that, and they certainly don't like the idea that a narrative is being created that is the pro-Israel community that is pushing for these things, whereas the pro-Israel community is in some aspect quite split on this issue. But I think this is going to be a very critical thing, because it's not a new factor that sometimes some of these interest groups are going on pushing for things long after the situation has changed, and perhaps some of the people you think they're lobbying for have already shifted their positions. But it is going to happen. In fact, I would say it's already happening to a certain extent right now.
I was worried about keeping my remarks short, and Joe added another subject. But on Turkey, I would just recommend a book called Reset by Stephen Kinzer that focuses on Turkey and Iran, the two countries in the Middle East that have the most sort of democratic appeal to the United States. It's kind of an interesting thesis. But Turkey is, again, one of those countries which is in a somewhat more tumultuous state than it seemed to have been like 2 years ago. So where that's going is not entirely clear, but Turkey is going to be a very important player in the region. I did want to respond briefly to the idea of, do personalities make a difference? Rouhani is not Ahmadinejad. Just to share one anecdote with you, I spent a lot of time on the missile defense issue, and the U.S. is counting on a hostile Iran to be able to help sustain $10 billion a year in missile defense expenditures. And this was evident a little while back, looking at a briefing slide showing what our strategic missile defenses could do. And all of a sudden, I noticed in the corner of it, there's Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And I thought, well, that's interesting. You know, the president of Iran is on this slide. And I thought, I don't remember in 2001, 2002, Khatami being on the slide.
Yeah.
And why is he on the slide? Because he wouldn't have his finger on the nuclear trigger. That would be the supreme leader, Khamenei. Well, it's obvious. Ahmadinejad was so toxic. He was the perfect guy for every U.S. hardliner to drum up anti-Iranian sentiment. And Rouhani is and I appreciated the description, you know, not reformer is not quite right. I mean, moderate is more like it, but this is a guy that American public can relate to when he speaks. And I think that's going to make a big difference. There's going to be a big difference in what kind of campaigns those against an agreement with Iran can sustain in the United States. Finally, I'll end up with Joe's question, though, about how is this interim phase going? And I would say right now it's going pretty well. If you would have asked 6 months ago how the Iranian deception DNA would hold up in the face of an agreement like this, a lot of people would have predicted, well, you can't trust these people to carry out anything that they say they're going to do. Well, lo and behold, everything that Iran has agreed to do so far that they have done. And that means they have let the IAEA into the uranium mines. They've let them into the heavy water production facility. There are a number of enhancements of the inspection regime, which have gone fairly smoothly so far. And every other thing on the calendar which is due so far has been done. So I would say this interim agreement is off to a good start. My cautionary note applies to the ultimate agreement here, the agreement that this 6 months is supposed to help facilitate. And there are some very big questions there about what kind of regime are the 6 countries going to insist on to raise their confidence level that Iran's nuclear program is not a clandestine nuclear weapons program. And there's some very thorny questions to sort through there. What number of centrifuges can Iran operate? At what locations? what technological sophistication can these centrifuges have, and so forth. These things have not been resolved, and there's very different views of this across the spectrum in the U.S., particularly in the U.S. Congress. And the U.S. Congress presumably is not going to have to explicitly ratify this agreement, but they can make a lot of trouble in trying to see through its implementation. The final point that most people haven't focused on is that this comprehensive ultimate agreement will not last forever. There will be a period of time after which Iran will become a normal non-nuclear weapon state under the NPT and not presumably have a lot of special conditions applied against it. How long is that after this agreement is reached? I think some of the Iranians have been talking about maybe 3 years. Some of the Americans have been talking about, well, 20 or 30. So that's a pretty big difference right now, and it hasn't gotten much attention. But I continue to be optimistic that there will be an agreement between the parties here that will raise the confidence level on the side of the 6 parties that Iran's program has no quick breakout option for nuclear weapons, and on the part of Iran that the parties to these negotiations are not using the nuclear weapons suspicion as an excuse to work toward regime change.
2 requests, and the first one I think we're all very enthusiastic about, and that is expressing our appreciation to a tremendous panel.